It's Tuesday, November 12th, 2019. This is Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm here today on St. Simon's Island with Mr. Joe Wilkinson. Mr. Wilkinson is a graduate of the University of Georgia's Grady School of Journalism. I believe it's mass communications as well now. He worked as a spokesman and media director for the Coca-Cola Company. He was also a captain in the United States Naval Reserve and a Desert Storm veteran. A lifelong Republican, he was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives in 2000, retiring in 2016. Thank you very much, Joe, for hosting Cheryl and I here at your home. We really do appreciate it.
Well, glad you're here.
We're glad to be here. I was wondering if we could just start. Tell us a little bit about your childhood and your upbringing over in Atlanta.
Well, I'm fifth generation Atlantan, but I point out to both our boys who are sixth generation Atlantans that they're also second generation Americans, because Pat's mother immigrated from Northern Ireland, and I think that's important. But I was very fortunate that all the family was in Atlanta, and so I got to see, be around, my grandmothers, and one grandfather, Charles F. Wilkinson, Senior, he was the vice president of Candler Properties and ran the Candler building for years and years. So I was very fortunate. Unfortunately, my father, of course, I'm a classic baby boomer, September 3rd, 1946. And you can tell when your dad got back from the war, because you were born used to. But,
Some quick math.
Yes, very quick math. And, anyway, he had 3 years in England with the 8th Air Force and came back. My mother's first husband was a naval officer who was lost at sea, another Atlantan, and so they got married, and right at the end of World War II, and then I came along a year later. It was a situation. My father, if I'd had his looks and everything else, his intelligence, he was something. And his older brother was a very prominent physician, 10 years older. But it was interesting. My father was hired by General Electric, and the morning that he and my mother were going to fly to Schenectady to look for a house, because that's where they were going to be transferred, he had a massive stroke. He was 26 years old and never really recovered. And a very difficult time. And, money was tight, but it was, we hung in. And then, unfortunately, it was November of 1962, he had a massive stroke, and was paralyzed and had to be put in a VA nursing home he lived another 14 years. So it wasn't easy, but you just plod along.
You went to high school at Marist and North Fulton County, correct? So tell me how and why that came about.
Well, and my late father had gone to Marist, where he had done incredibly well, and it came along at the time. It was part of Atlanta that was just amazing, part of Atlanta history, because of desegregation. And the thought was that the public schools, Atlanta public schools, would be shut down. I'd gone to Rock Springs Elementary School, 1st through 7th grade. And it was, well, you're a Marist legacy and so forth. And so I wound up going there, and it was a terrible fit. It just didn't work out. Now, the military was fine, but it just was not what I wanted and so forth. And all my friends were at North Fulton. And so when the opportunity arose, I transferred to North Fulton, and which I'm still very appreciative of the school. And I was the highlight of my life, the 2017 Buckhead Boy of the Year. I should bring in it's a Jack Davis poster. Yeah, so Marist was not a good fit for me at all. Again, the military was great, but it just was not. I just did not fit in there, and I can remember that it was my parents wanted me to take Latin, and like I said, Daddy had gone to Marist, and then my mother went to Knapp's, North Avenue Presbyterian School, which became Westminster with Washington Seminary, and I'll never forget the principal, Father Brennan. He basically was telling us we weren't smart enough to take Latin. Well, they were saving those seats for the Roman Catholics, Episcopalian, and the Mass was in Latin. So I said, no, you all aren't smart enough to take Latin. Well, I, of course, go to North Fulton and take 3 years and with honors in Latin. So, but North Fulton, very special to me. And as I said, Marist worked well for others, but it just wasn't my place.
So tell me how you got involved in politics. Did you or interested, I guess? Was your family interested in politics or follow politics? Or
interested
involved?
in news, and as I said, my late father had joined General Electric, so I've remembered TVs from the time I was just basically born. And I think it would be an understatement to call me a news junkie. I grew up loving news and being exposed to it because, again, we had a TV. And then the other was my father was interested in radio and so forth, so we had shortwave radio. And from my earliest days, I would listen to the BBC. He'd turn it on and so forth, the BBC, Radio Deutsche Welle. And so I really got a great exposure to news. And I just always loved news. And 1952, I can still remember the coverage. I was 5 going on 6 about the Democrats and the Republicans trying to recruit General Dwight Eisenhower to run for president. And I remember all of that so well, and was exposed to it. And then my parents had a subscription to the Atlanta Journal. We didn't have the Constitution, but the Journal. And that was the afternoon paper.
Right.
And I would read that every day, put it out on the floor and read it front to back. And just always loved it. And then I think the biggest turning point was 1956, and that was Huntley and Brinkley, and Chet Huntley and David Brinkley. And they teamed up and did the Democrat convention and the Republican convention, and then they did the Huntley-Brinkley report, which was a 15-minute show when it started. And we would have dinner, but I would get permission to take my plate and go into the living room and eat on a little table and watch Huntley Brinkley. I had more dinners with Huntley and Brinkley than I had with my own family. So I've always loved news.
So do you remember when that transition went from an interest in news to an interest in politics?
Yes.
And Republican politics in particular?
Yeah. And I well remember it was 1952, the general election, and my friend Buddy Copeland and his parents were quite active Republicans, and then had grown up with my parents in Atlanta. We handed out "I Like Ike" keychains in front of Winter and Roberts Drugstore in Buckhead. It was on right there at Peachtree at that point. Mm-hmm. Of course, now it's over next where the OK Cafe and so forth.
Right.
But I well remember handing out those keychains and campaigning and so forth, and then handing out bumper stickers, the "I Like Ike" bumper stickers and so forth. So that began that. But watching news and being exposed to all the politics, yeah.
So I don't need to tell you, but the state was entirely Democratic, had never voted for a Republican presidential candidate. Why Eisenhower? Why the Republican Party?
Of course, I was quite familiar with him, and I've been like I said, a news junkie, a history buff all my life, and had such a special interest in Eisenhower, and I would say he was the reason that I was drawn there. Mm-hmm. I remember in 1960, my mother voted for John Kennedy. My father, of course, for Richard Nixon. But during all those years growing up, as I said, I just had such an interest in I would say it was because of Eisenhower. And you're right. I mean, there were just a handful of Republicans, and I was fortunate to get to be able to go to a lot of meetings, and even as a youngster, and meet the founders of the Republican Party of Georgia, if you will.
And who were those folks, and what do you remember about them at that time?
Of course, we had a very, very dear friend and neighbor, Rodney Cook, who grew up with my parents, and it's Rodney Mims Cook Sr. And I can remember Mr. Thrower, Randolph Thrower, and there were forgive me. We had Magic Marts.
Dillard Munford.
Dillard Munford, and so forth. And so I was very fortunate to get to see those folks and get invited to some events,
right,
and so forth.
So some would argue the modernization of the Republican Party in Georgia came with Goldwater and sort of the Goldwater revolution that sort of energized a conservative grassroots within the Republican Party. Heretofore relatively moderate compared to Georgia Democrats, at least. Tell me about what you remember about the Goldwater Campaign in 63 and 64.
I was very involved. As I mentioned, my father had another massive stroke, and as a result, I really couldn't get a summer job, because I was having to drive him to Easter Seals to physical therapy there on West Peachtree Street, and so I was limited with. I had some free time, but I couldn't really work. I'd worked at the Putt-Putt on Cheshire Bridge before that. So it worked out that I was able to volunteer, and in 1963 joined the draft Goldwater for President campaign. It was on Piedmont Road, right near across the street from Rock Springs Church, Presbyterian Church, in East Rock Springs Road. And so I got involved with that. John Savage, Dr. Savage was, along with his dental partner, Chris Callahan, were the ones running that operation. And so as literally a 16-year-old, I was in the Goldwater Campaign, and it was exciting. And you're absolutely right. That's what changed Georgia. And of course, he carried Georgia in '64, the first time a Republican won the state.
So you were telling me the other night you attended the historic 1964 Republican convention in Fulton County, which was really the out with the old, in with the new breed of Republican.
And again, I was able to go as a delegate, even though I was 17. If you pre-registered to vote and you were going to turn 18 before the primary in September, which I was by a couple of weeks, so I could go as a delegate, and did, and probably the youngest there at 17. And I well remember that fight at the old municipal auditorium. And I can remember the next day, the front page of the Journal-Constitution, Dr. Stelling with his clenched fists, shaking his fist. And I'm trying to remember, it was one of the old established leaders of the party. It was, that was the change, and that was it. Now, I will tell you something that I noticed and so forth. Some neighbors took me to a rally at the Dinkler Plaza, I believe it was, and General Edwin Walker, who they're saying that Lee Harvey Oswald may have actually taken shots at him in his house, before he assassinated President Kennedy. But and it was quite interesting, and I saw a lot of people. Their main interest was segregation, and I said that's not what I'm interested in, and so I wound up being very involved. And the party was so small. It was so small. I mean, they were delighted to have, a person who could actually answer a phone and work and talk and would talk. Matter of fact, I had a case of Goldwater. And,
do you still have it?
No, I do have a can that I got on eBay.
Okay.
I've said, God invented eBay so that baby boomers could get everything back that their moms sold when they went off to college.
You're not far off. I don't suspect.
I mean, that's exactly why it was invented, I'm sure. But matter of fact, I had, and it's in the documentary about my office at the Capitol. I had that can there, but it was an exciting time. I can remember. I was trying to remember the other day with you, and I believe it was Earl Patton, who I was very, very close to. Not at that time, but he was one of the young, up and coming, right. And so forth, and another Buckhead boy, North Fulton, and so forth. But Earl had, I remember, he referred to the Goldwater delegates at that convention as alien and extremist. And then it was it was earlier than that, a short time before that, Ralph McGill, and of course with his column on the front page of the Constitution, referred to Goldwater supporters as kooks and nuts. Interesting time.
So that sounds like a McGill column. Yeah. So right after that, you would have been 17, turning 18. So after that, you went to University of Georgia?
Yeah, I wound up I did campaigns even well before that. As I said, handing out I Like Ike keychains in 1952, the 56 reelection, and handing out bumper stickers and so forth. 60, I was involved with Teens for Nixon, and then in 1961, Rodney Cook and Richard Freeman ran for what was then the Board of Aldermen. And so I worked in their campaigns and helped them. And then in 60...
And those were Buckhead precincts, or
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, it was Buckhead. And then, and I got to be, of course, known Rodney all my life. And as I said, he was a year younger than my mother, but they were at Spring Street Elementary School, and for Georgia Day, he was General Oglethorpe, and my mother played Mrs. Oglethorpe, even though there was no Mrs. Oglethorpe, evidently, till much later.
For dramatic purposes.
Yes, well, creative license.
Right.
So I grew up all around that and so forth, and then in 1962, it was the Democrat primary, Charlie Weltner and James C. Davis.
Judge Davis.
Yeah, and where Charlie upset him and won and so forth. And then in 63, as I said, doing the Goldwater, draft Goldwater, 64, the various campaigns. 65, we had there had been reapportionment and ordered by the courts. So I helped in those campaigns.
Special election. Were they June, July? I think it was they were summer, the 65.
It was summer.
Yeah.
And that's when we really first had Republicans elected to the House. And Ralph McClellan had been, he was Democrat, because you couldn't get elected as Republican. But he served in the State House. And as I recall, at that time, we had like maybe 3 state representatives representing Fulton County.
Oh, yeah. Before was it Westbury v. Sanders?
Yep. And so it was it was an interesting time, to say the least, and I was right in the thick of it. I mean, even as a youngster.
Now, did you maintain that interest in politics when you went to UGA?
Oh, very much so. But anyway, one of the first things I did was join the Young Republicans, and the fact of the matter is, we as Republicans were not able to really win much. And so we just fought each other. That was got to be really ridiculous. And there was some very, very right-wing folks, Young Americans for Freedom, and they were quite out there. But it was interesting times, and we wound up, many of us are still in touch and keep up with each other. But that's when, of course, Bo came to speak to the Wowers, and so that's where I first met him, and we wound up. I was hired as the youngest paid staff member of the Callaway for Governor campaign, and it was. I well remember. I got paid $300 a month, which was quite a lot of money in that time. And the University of Georgia, I think it was $85 a quarter, and then books and so forth. So I really paid for my next year of college from the Callaway campaign.
So tell me, what was the average day for the youngest paid staffer on the Callaway campaign?
It's you've heard the term gopher, and I did everything from pick up the mail in the morning, and of course, Bo was still in Congress, and go to the Atlanta airport, pick him up, bring him back to the office, and he and Bill Amos had a condo on West Peachtree Street, right around the corner from the office, and so I was the gopher, and whatever needed to be done. But at the same time, they gave me a good bit of responsibility for. I was 19, going on 20, and research and so forth, and of course Arnold, the former governor, was the leading candidate.
Right.
And we all thought we'd be running against Arnold, and so I did a lot of opposition research, and used to go to the old Atlanta library and go through all the old was it micro?
Was it microfilm or microfiche? Fiche was the cards. Film was obviously the.
Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah,
it was more, and going through and so, which I loved. I mean, being a news junkie and loving politics. But so yeah, my nickname became Bojo, and then when I went to Callaway Gardens for that year to work with Bo, and he didn't, by the way, as you well know, he didn't run for the Senate then.
Right.
Again, I was at Callaway Gardens. I was Bojo.
So you mentioned Bill Amos, who is the campaign manager.
Right.
Who were the other sort of grandees in the Callaway campaign back in '66?
Well, of course, Mr. Mumford was heavily involved. Frank Strickland, who Frank had graduated from Vanderbilt, and then did 4 years active duty as a Coast Guard officer. Well, matter of fact, he stayed in the reserves as well. And then, oh my goodness, John White, who's still my best friend from the Coca-Cola Company. John was a press secretary. There were, I can still see that office on West Peachtree, and and I wound up actually working out of there for another campaign.
How involved was the state party with Paul Jones and the executive director?
Mike Hudson.
Or was it Alex Hodges?
Alex Hodges later.
Right.
Yeah, Alex, who fraternity brother and best friends with Governor Deal.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
No.
And Alex, of course, went on active duty, and Mike Hudson, who was from Mississippi, was executive director, and then Alex came back, and it was, there was Alan Jones, and I'm just looking at, went on to be federal judge. Forgive me.
No.
Looking right at him, died a few years ago.
Nixon appointee?
Yeah.
Was that a Limo?
No, I've got a whole chapter on Tony. It was, what's wrong? I'm looking right at him. I may have to call John.
Sure.
A lifeline there. Again, we were all pretty young. Of course, I was a kid. I mean, compared, and John, I thought he was ancient. He was 22. But it's that. But the state party, you had, of course, G. Paul Jones from Macon, and some others who started early, and whatnot. I used to always point out to Bo I was a Republican before he was.
Yeah, his family was out of the Talmadge camp.
Oh yeah,
Fred Hand and
from Pelham and so forth. Yeah, and of course Bo was on the Board of Regents.
Mm-hmm.
And, the Republicans didn't get appointed to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
You mentioned earlier, the conventional wisdom was that Ellis Arnold was going to come out of this primary after Ernest Vandiver had bowed out because of his heart troubles.
right.
Do you remember what it was like in the campaign when the runoff came and it was Arnold versus Maddox?
Very well.
Was there an effort to say, hey, we'd really like to run against Lester Maddox instead of Ellis Arnold?
And, I have denied that, but I was, because I didn't want to let people know how stupid we were back then. But no, that's exactly the truth. They figured could run against Lester, clobber him, and then move on. And I mean, again, I remember it like it was yesterday, and even though it's almost 54 years ago, when and it was Bill Amos and others. But see, the underlying thing was Bo was very close to Richard Nixon,
Mm-hmm.
and this was the new Nixon, and the goal was for Bo to be elected governor of Georgia, and then to be Nixon's running mate in '68, and that was the whole motive, was to build up a Bo already had a great resume, but to build up that resume and get the national exposure and so forth, and then go on and run for vice president.
Right, because Callaway had even gone up to New York to the Lynx Club up there, and a very high dollar fundraisers with the sort of who's who of the Eastern establishment, so to speak.
And
Nixon had hosted.
Oh gosh, yes. And and when I would pick up the mail, and I'd be sorting it in the morning, and I of course would see the ones from Richard M. Nixon, and from New York City,
Mm-hmm.
and that was the goal, and we had a reunion, a Callaway Campaign reunion, years and years ago, and Bill Amos had said, they went on to be Nixon's vice president, and the great administration and the honesty and so forth that all had expected. But yes, I can well remember those. It'd be at least once a week there'd be correspondence from Richard M. Nixon.
So do you remember how the strategy changed after the runoff? I guess October 1 was the big parade down Peachtree, or
was this the one for
the Callaway's kickoff? The kickoff to the election, or maybe that was September 1. Anyway.
Well, we did the. I remember doing the kickoff in Columbus, and I trying to think for a second. Actually, I think it was around July.
Maybe it was. Maybe it was before the runoff and everything.
Yeah, we did the kickoff and so forth. But again, I was not at that level. But the strategy was, it'll be easier to beat Lester Maddox, and you'll be able to just overwhelm him, and that'll build up Bo to be Nixon's vice president.
Where were you on election day when the votes?
I was at headquarters. I was very, very fortunate that the University of Georgia, again, the School of Journalism, the professors, and Dean Drury was dean at the time, they were willing to let me, spend some time, because of course everybody thought Bo was going to be governor.
Right.
And so I can remember taking a Greyhound bus from Athens to downtown Atlanta.
I know where the station is.
Yeah.
It's a restaurant now.
Oh, really?
Yep.
And the next morning, I was at headquarters and spent that weekend. I spent that evening. Of course, I voted, and then went to headquarters there on West Peachtree Street, and again, we thought, this was a slam dunk. And I do remind people, Bo won the popular vote, 3,039 more votes, and that was with them counting. So who knows where it really was. But yeah, we were just in shock. And when it went into the runoff, no, it didn't go to the runoff, but I mean, when we were hoping for a runoff.
Right.
I can remember Dr. Albert Say, who had one of the most remarkable professors, and I was so blessed to get to study constitutional law under him as an undergrad. But he was the expert on the Georgia Constitution, and he told Bo, he said, no, there will not be a runoff. This is the way this is set up. It's going to go to the legislature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there was the biennial is in December, and I recall that Callaway went to the biennial at UGA. Were you the,
absolutely?
You would have been a student,
and I was on the front page with Bo.
Really?
Of the it wasn't the Bannerhead Daily News, the Athens Daily News, and it was so funny. Mimi Austin, who had worked for Bo in Washington and then in the campaign in Atlanta, she got Bo to autograph the picture, and she said, I might have the only real Bo Callaway autograph. I mean, we all could do his signature perfectly.
Well, now we know.
Oh, yes. And but this one was for real. But I was on the front page of the paper with him over at the Continuing Ed Center,
where it's still held.
I've for years I instructed there, and the Carl Vinson Institute would have me come do the lecture. If only I had known. And I did that for years. And then, of course, I was required to teach ethics. So I would do If Only I'd Known and the first part of the ethics requirements. Yeah.
Did you attend the session of the General Assembly where they voted?
It was what happened. Again, we were hoping for a runoff.
Right.
And so I was, you needed to be like a senior to have an internship. But the Dean Drury went ahead and let me have an internship. And I was a sophomore. Okay. And he let me have an internship. And lo and behold, when there was no runoff and no campaign, that's when the state party hired me. They didn't pay me. Well, they wanted to, but the Democrats refused to pay the Republican aides. That was not pretty. But yes, I was. We were working it. I was there. I was in 403 of the Capitol, and which before it got remodeled, and he. I remember it so well, and it was just tragic. And I can remember Bo being interviewed as he was leaving. And he gave a statement. The General Assembly has chosen to give my opponent, the governorship and so forth. I was on the House floor, And I will never forget when I got home, my mother said, "What were you doing with Julian Bond?" And I was, and it turns out it's where that aisle and where I sat for many, many years. I was there, and I said, "I can't believe this." And a voice behind me said, "Well, I guess we better get used to it." And I turned, it was Julian. And I was, on TV and so forth. But, oh yeah, it was awful. And I wound up, staying and for that session, working for the Republican minority. We had, there were 205 members of the House then, and I think we had 25 or 26 Republicans. So Custer had a better shot than we did.
Well, in Callaway's papers over at the Russell, there are folders with every legislator and senator, and has broken down by affiliation, organizations they belong to, how many times the campaign or Bo had called them, different people who could maybe put some pressure on this person to vote for Callaway.
Absolutely.
Was that a campaign level effort to put together those sort of dossiers, I guess?
And I worked on a lot of those, and mainly, just the paperwork.
Right.
I wasn't at a level, and I was too young to call the legislators and ask them. I mean, because Bo and Bill were, and Paul Jones, they were the ones that were making those calls.
Right.
And Fletcher Thompson.
Sure.
And Ben Blackburn. So those are the calls. Oh, I well remember the effort, and it was, and I can remember the debate. Jamie Oglesby from Thomasville was the new minority leader, and I can remember when, and I was working directly for Jamie, since there was no campaign for me to go to, and I was his aide, and I can remember him being challenged about who Thomas County voted for. They said Maddox. They said, "And you're casting your vote for Callaway? Don't you think you should vote for the way your citizens and et cetera and constituents?" But of course, that was the other hope. I mean, it was so malapportioned.
Oh.
And we didn't stand a chance, and there was always the hope that the feds might intervene.
Right. Well, you were just talking about working with Jamie Oglesby, so he was in the Senate.
No, he was in the House.
House. That's right. I guess Oliver Bateman probably would.
Oliver was
the Senate.
Yeah.
Because Oglesby took over for Roy Simpkins, who had run for Congress that year.
And
over in Augusta.
And then, well, what had happened, we really had not had a minority leader.
Right.
And it was Paul Jones at the biennial who announced that Jamie was going to be the minority leader. I did not know I knew his cousins from Elberton. Of course, he lived in Thomasville, but originally from Elberton. But I knew his cousins, the Teasleys, good friends from the neighborhood, and from.
Is that of John Teasley, Sam Teasley? No relation?
No relation. Oh, I take it back. Yes, Sam's father and my friend Ben were, I believe, first cousins.
Okay.
So yeah, it's the same. I'm sorry, it's the same line. But then that's met Jamie, and I went to work, and they tried. Jack Whitehurst was the attorney, and he had been very active in the Republican Party early on in the 30s and so forth. And but the Democrats would not pay the Republican aides. I mean, they didn't even want us using the, of course, back then we called them Xerox machines, but the photocopy. We would have to go to the clerk's office. There were two ladies, and they would look and decide whether or not we could make copies. I mean, notices for the caucus and everything else. It was that difficult.
So we can talk about that a little bit more when we get around to when you were actually in the General Assembly. But you mentioned earlier that you went to work directly for Callaway. Was this after this internship or sort of concurrent to?
What happened was the way things worked. I didn't have to go on active duty,
Right.
And
you were Army ROTC at UGA.
yeah, and of course, 3 years at Marist, and then the 2 years at North Fulton, and then 2+ years. And lo and behold, I wound up a naval officer. So it all worked out, and so forth. But that was I didn't have to go on active duty, and so all of a sudden, I'm open, and that's when Bill Amos called me first, and said, "Can you get over to the Gardens?" I said, "Yep," and that's when they said, "Okay, we're going to put this campaign together," and that's when I met, I said, that newly minted PhD, Newt Gingrich, and so that's how that worked out, that I could go to Callaway Gardens for a year. By the way, single, living at the Mr. Kaysen, Bo's dad, had built in the original Holiday Inn in the basement. He built a poker room and some other stuff, and they converted it into apartments. And so I lived there, and I was very, very thin, very thin. I was about 5'10" and maybe 128 pounds. But at Callaway Gardens, they treated me as an employee. So breakfast was 50 cents, lunch was 75, dinner $1.25, all you could eat. And I went from about 128 pounds to 180 pounds that year. All that great food.
Well, that's the risk you take with buffet style.
That's it. And it was, and my tennis partner was the food and beverage manager. So I could just go over to the kitchen morning, noon, and night.
So during this period in the state party's history, that you mentioned Republicans fighting each other. This was really the showdown between the Nixon folks and the Reagan campaign. That was, I guess, based out of DeKalb County at that time. Jim Westlake and those those guys out of DeKalb.
South DeKalb.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
We called them the hardware gang.
Yes.
Because they always hung out at that hardware store.
Right.
And he, when I was an intern, Jim just would have fits with me. He didn't think I was conservative enough. And actually, when I did leave Callaway Gardens, and I went to work for EPA for about a year, I worked for Jim. And we got along quite well.
Sure.
But I well remember that crowd. Oh my goodness, the hardware gang.
So I assume that you were probably a Nixon supporter, like Callaway at the, or were you a dreaded Nelson Rockefeller supporter?
Well, I had I was trying to, thinking about the future,
Sure,
and so forth, and maybe one day running and so forth. But I liked Rockefeller, mm-hmm. and got to spend a lot of time with him that next year, '69, so and so forth. But then, of course, I wound up heading we were college students for Nixon, I believe it was. Mm. I'm trying to remember. I was very involved with it. And I was campaign director
sure.
for Georgia. And But yeah, I was very fortunate to get to spend time in college. A friend of mine was working for for Rockefeller, and I got to come up to New York. And matter of fact, Governor Rockefeller brought me up to spend a week to to help with a congressional campaign. First time I'd been to New York and so forth. And of course, we worked out of his offices. He had 22 West 55th Street and had some brownstones in his offices. And then that next year, Nixon had asked him to assist with a South American effort. And Rockefeller had, in World War II, that's where he wound up working, for the federal government,
right,
focusing on South America. He was just fascinating man. And he wasn't very good with names. And was hiya fella, hiya fella. As always, yeah, quite. And again, as I said, I have been so fortunate to be exposed to so many of these people.
Right.
And
so you're there 68, 69. Were you in the state and involved in politics during the 1970
yes
campaign?
Yes.
I guess that was the first Republican primary.
Or
maybe
yes,
60, yeah.
It was 70. Yeah. 68. The Senate between Earl Patton and Jack Sells.
That's right.
But 70, yes, and we had Judge Tanksley,
mm-hmm.
Hal Suit,
right,
and what's wrong with me?
Jimmy Bentley.
Jimmy, yeah, sorry, because I was very close to the Bentleys. And I remember the state convention, and of course Judge Tanksley had lost a leg in World War II,
mm-hmm.
and Jimmy Bentley had been in a car wreck, and somebody said the Republican Party doesn't have a good leg to stand on. All three of them had been, hurt, but I can remember Hal Suit coming to interview us in 1963 in the draft Goldwater Campaign,
mm-hmm.
and I can remember Chris Callahan was there, and they literally threw Hal Suit out of the aisle. He was just mocking Goldwater, said he had a stack of cards, et cetera, et cetera. And then when he announced, I was shocked. I mean, I thought he was not a Republican. So 70 was the first real gubernatorial primary, because Bo got on by petition.
You mentioned that story about Hal Suit. What the interesting thing is, when you go back and look at the breakdown of support and where the votes came from and everything, Roscoe Pickett and the DeKalb, the conservative wing, we'll say the Reaganite wing, supported Hal Suit over Jimmy Bentley.
Yep.
Was that simply because Bo Callaway had inserted himself into the
that was
primary?
a large part of it, and of course you've got to remember that in '68, Bo forced Roscoe out as national committeeman, and there was some very bad blood there. Marguerite Williams from Thomasville got behind Hal Suit early and helped him financially. Marguerite was a force to be reckoned with.
1988 comes to mind.
Yeah, and it was a vicious time,
mm-hmm.
and so forth. I had, of course, I had Charlie Tanksley, and still a friend, Judge Tanksley's son, who served in the state senate. But I was very. I wound up doing more to help Jimmy because of Bo and so forth, and I can remember in the state convention again where they had the film about him walking through the graveyard explaining to his ancestors why he had to be a Republican and so forth, and with Jimmy Bentley doing that.
Right.
So he was always incredibly helpful to me.
He after that campaign, he I think he said in the newspaper and in other interviews, I think there was a Sunday AJC, the Sunday magazine, and he said one of his biggest regrets was joining the Republican Party because he thought the party was ready, and he seemed really disillusioned.
He was
by that experience.
He was, because keep in mind he'd been elected statewide.
Oh yeah,
as a young man, and Comptroller General and so forth.
Yeah, insurance. Yeah, when it was all in one.
And he, very much so. And I can understand because he was the rising star, and just and again very, very helpful, and always to young people especially.
Right.
I mean he always wanted to help, take you under wing.
Well, you mentioned 72, the Senate campaign that never was. January 71, Senator Russell passes away.
Right.
Governor Carter appoints David Gambrell,
right,
who had been chairman of the Georgia Democratic Party, King and Spalding attorney, very prominent family. What was the thinking for Callaway, who was national committeeman at the time? What was his thinking going into a potential race?
He very much wanted to run, and he had always felt that he got cheated, and he was from being governor and possibly vice president. Going into it, that we were going to have to do some fence mending, and that was my job. And I can remember he and Beth had the home up near the country store, up the road from the Holiday Inn, and my office was up there, the campaign office. And I went up there one day, and Bo was always into health. I mean, and he had gone home to have a bowl of soup. And I'll never forget, he said, "How's it going?" And I told him. And he said, "I never promised you a rose garden." And I'll never forget, Bill Amos called me. He said, "Never tell a candidate the truth," particularly if they're doing poorly. And we spent all that time. I mean, we went all over the state and trying to mend fences, and knew the three of us would go constantly, but that was it was very disappointing. And then he reached the point, this isn't going to work. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, he had me transfer out of the Callaway Campaign and to go to work for Garden Services. So I actually went to work for Callaway Gardens.
So you would attribute his
excuse me.
No, you're fine.
Sorry.
His decision not to run is sort of the culmination of those political battles from 68, 70. It was just too much to overcome with the Republican primary electorate.
Yeah. And of course Fletcher Thompson
right.
Fletcher he wasn't going to get reelected to Congress. So, you know, that's when he was making the move,
Right.
To go for the Senate, which of course he did run for it. But yes, that was the
Right,
the
because
turning
that would have
point.
been a reapportioned 5th district, right?
And he, I mean, we just kept getting all this negative feedback because Bo had been so involved in that gubernatorial primary, and again, he angered the House suit supporters, and you know, and he was at a very great disadvantage of winning that primary.
Right, and from there, I guess he became Secretary of the Army in '73. Yeah.
He what happened? He had been the civilian aide, and then Nixon appointed him Secretary of the Army, and it was really something. Bo graduated from West Point in 1949, and so for his 25th anniversary, graduation, so forth, you know, normally it's the commander-in-chief who gets invited and gets his choice of which academy and so forth he's going to speak at in graduation, and it worked out well, and I think Nixon made a special effort so Bo could be the graduation speaker at his in 1974, which was his 25th anniversary, and that was one of his most special moments.
I think we have some photographs at the library of him watching the football game and different things up around that time.
He, of course, it was June of '74, but he. I was, of course, when he and President Ford were very close, and they, you know, Bo only had the 2 years in Congress, but he got to be real close to Gerald Ford, and I can remember we had a car phone, which was a big deal, and you know, Congressman Ford calling, you know, and so forth, but I can well remember President. I think they were at Fort Benning. I'm trying to remember when President Ford said, "I want you to be my campaign chair," and Bo didn't want to give up Secretary of the Army, but you know, the president asked.
Right.
It's what you do, and he. I will never forget seeing the coverage, and I said, "Something's not right here," and that's when he left and to be the campaign chair. And if you remember, he had to leave that over false allegations made by a newspaper out in Colorado. And,
the Crested Butte.
Well, I'm trying to think if it was Gunnison or Crested, because he was in Crested Butte. But he loved being Secretary of the Army. He really did.
So when did you go to Washington?
Well, actually, the way it worked out, literally the first time I got to go to Washington was for the Nixon inaugural in '69, and having been all involved again with the Nixon campaign, and it was I'll never forget. It was of course January 20th. In 1969, and there was a fellow who was celebrating his 30th birthday that day, and he was head of the inaugural for Georgia, Paul Coverdale, and so it was Paul's 30th birthday, and we went over to see the various events and whatnot, but that was my first trip to Washington, and then as it worked out, with the Navy and with President Ford and so forth, I would fly back and forth, and would stay at the old Twin Bridges Marriott, and then of course later they built the JW, and then the Madison. We stayed there a lot because of the Coca-Cola Company, but I was back and forth constantly.
So when did you join the Ford presidential campaign?
Oh, it was when Bo went over to be the campaign manager. Yeah, and it was the PFC, the President Ford Committee.
Right.
And so that's when Bo brought me over, and I was going back and forth to Washington constantly.
Did you stay on when it was transitioned from Bo to James Baker?
No.
No, you didn't.
I take it back. Yes, I did. I actually, I'm sorry. I went over to the press office. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's right. I'm sorry.
No.
It was. I went, and yeah, that's. And it was a. We just had that hope that just maybe somehow we can pull it off. But after Watergate, it was going to be difficult.
Well, that was a very, very professional campaign. I've done some research in those papers up at Ann Arbor, and this is archivist speak, but it's a very highly processed, very easily accessible and usable collection, the President for Ford Committee. Was Bob Teeter, or was it David Gergen maybe?
Yeah,
was
Gergen's been everywhere.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I think Ford through Nixon through Clinton maybe.
And actually, in 1994, when the Navy assigned me to take President Clinton to Normandy for the 50th anniversary.
Watching that on TV. It was the first day there was no school that day. I remember sitting on the couch watching the 50th anniversary.
And I can remember being there, at Versailles, in '82 for the economic summit, and David was there, and I had to go tell him he was watching the French Open, and everybody could see he wasn't paying attention to the briefing when I went that last basically public appearance speech by President Reagan. He said we flew over the White House, everything. Dave Gergen's still there, and all that jokes. But it was through the Ford campaign that I got to meet so many people, and Larry Speaks, and Larry's family and my wife's family were both one of the prominent families in Mississippi, and that helped with. But I got to know so many of those folks, and that's how I wound up getting to have the best of all worlds.
So President Ford came up short against Governor Carter, President Carter. So what are you doing between 1976 and 1980 when there's another Republican president?
Well, I had been working for an ad agency, and in 1977 I joined the Coca-Cola Company.
Okay.
And then in 1980, President Reagan wins, and I get the call. And would you like to, you want to come in the administration and to the White House? And my wife said, she said, you're working for the company you've always wanted to work for. And she was reaching her 10th anniversary with Delta, which you're vested and all this stuff. She said, no. And, so what happened was when President Reagan was shot, of course, Jim Brady was shot.
Right.
And man, our nickname was Bear. We called him Bear and so forth. And it was just so sad. I mean, it was like they'd taken part of a computer out, had no memory of a lot of things and so forth. But Larry called me. He said, I got to have somebody up here I can trust. And somebody's going to, tell me the truth and so forth. And I said, I'm not going to come full time, whatever. Well, Don Keogh was the new president of the company and so forth. And I get a call from Florence, his assistant. I went upstairs and he said, well, I just talked to the president. I said, well, to myself, well, you're the president, And he said, no, President Reagan just called and you're on loan whenever they need you. And I said, sir? He said, you're on loan to the White House and to the Reagans, and you're covered, don't worry. And so that's how it worked out. I got the best of all worlds.
Right.
Stay at the Coca-Cola Company and then go up to the White House and then all the overseas trips, because I wound up being the chief of staff, but it's, you're still you do everything again type thing. You're a gopher, but to the president of Coke International, I've been his PR man, so it worked out. And so I got to go back and forth, and I would get a call, and we're going to go into to Beijing, and can you give us a week? Yeah, sure, and wound up going all over the world with him in economic summits, and it was very special, just a remarkable time. And I'd finish up, and we'd maybe fly on the press plane back to Washington, and then pack up and go back to Atlanta.
So you were at Coke during a very, very busy historic time. Diet Coke.
July 1982. I was the assistant PR director.
Okay.
Yeah.
So because Coke was very resistant to doing a diet product for a long, because they had Tab.
And Mr. Woodruff was not. Yeah. And yeah, Tab had
which no offense is not the best tasting product Coke
well
makes.
and it's we always pointed out to people, Tab was the banking mentality. You drank a Tab, you knew you were saving 96 calories, and then for Diet Coke, the campaign, the slogan, just for the taste of it, because it did taste great, still does, and but just for the taste of it.
Were you there for? You were obviously there for New Coke.
Oh yes.
Which I will say was re-released briefly because of the Stranger Things tie-in on Netflix. That was my first time having New Coke.
It was. I was supposed to go with President and Mrs. Reagan, and it was a European swing, and it was, if you remember, the Bitburg situation, the cemetery, and all. So I was supposed to go on that trip, and I was sitting in my boss's office. I saw these unmarked aluminum cans, and I said, "Is this what we're hearing about?" He said, he went and shut the door. He said, "That's it." He said, "I can't let you, go on this trip. You've got to stay here with us." And Roberta Gosweda, the chairman, and Don Keogh's president, went to New York to do the announcement.
Right.
And my boss was the number 3 in the company, president of International. So he wound up hosting the employees at the Fox Theater, where we had, the live feed of the TV and so forth from New York. And I will never, ever forget it when we got back over to the company. And Klaus, and Robert always said Klaus was the smartest man in the company.
And Klaus was your...
Klaus Holla. And so Klaus had said, we should have called it Fountain Coke. He said, when you think of Fountain Coke, you think of the sweet, very sweet. And this was, of course, much sweeter, and so forth. And then all of a sudden it's just, negative we're hearing from. And there was the plant in San Francisco, they were shipping new Coke to Australia. And we got a telex. You remember the old telexes? And it was from the Australian operation. They said, we don't want it. It literally turned the ship around. And it was something, and I can remember my wife, David, our older one, was a little over a year old, and so I would keep him while she went to church. And she came in one day from church, and she said, "That's it." She says, "I'm not going in public again." She said, "That's all people want to talk about." And so I came up with a suggestion. We have, some sort of brochure, and which they did. Probably were going to do it anyway. But it was not pretty, and of course. Don did the ad. People said we did it deliberately. He said we're not that dumb and we're not that smart. But it was. But the interesting thing, the Pepsi was doing the taste tests for years.
Oh yeah.
And they would win it because again, you take a little sip, you want it sweet. If you're going to sit and have a thing, but it was they had to do it, but the one thing, and I remember Dr. Roy Stout, the researcher, was no one stopped and thought, well, if we take away what was the classic Coke, what's going to happen? If you don't have the option, and it was vicious.
There was a very legendary sort of lobbyist VP fixer at Coke, Ovid Davis. Mm-hmm. Was he still in the company when you started?
Oh yes, yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. And Ovid was he was a legend. He had gone to work in the 1930s,
right?
For Mr. Woodruff and so forth, and he was yes, he was a legend. And what a character! I mean, just a remarkable character. I mean, and he was. It's like one student once asked me. This was at the University of Georgia, the J School, and I was lecturing. The student said, "Can you tell me what's the best thing you ever did for the Coca-Cola company?" I said, "No." Nope. I said, "It goes to the grave." We don't, a lot of things we took care of. By the book, but
sure,
very carefully.
I won't ask any more questions.
No. I'll just deny everything.
Yeah. It's a good strategy.
Yeah.
So what sort of work were you doing with the Republican Party in Georgia in the 80s? Did you?
I volunteered just various things. I had in the 70s and 80s. I had throughout life. I did candidate recruitment, ballot security, the newsletter,
Right.
things like that. So and volunteer, and then there was talk of recruiting me to run for Congress, but the company didn't think that was a good idea.
So what was recruitment like in the 80s? What was it like trying to persuade, mostly young individuals to take a run at state house or state senate or
Yeah,
or
and I had been first. I was the first time I was candidate recruitment chairman was 1968,
Oh wow, yeah.
and still in college. It was it got much better because we were getting people elected, and
Right.
we had as the years went on, we had no trouble really
Sure.
because people wanted to run, and so forth. But yeah, early on, it was, it's one. If I get elected, I'm going to be so deep in the minority. That's what I was going to mention too. But when I was the intern, I got there in '67. There were 205 House members.
Right. Yeah.
Back then,
yeah.
and instead of the 180, and then and 10% Republicans. So we were deep in the minority. And if you wanted a bill passed or get something done, you had to go to a Democrat who would agree and say, that's a great idea, and then they would take it and run with it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So when did you decide? That obviously you ran in 2000, but what was behind your decision to finally run yourself for elective office?
What had happened is Dorothy Felton, who was my predecessor, served 26 years, first Republican woman, elected to the House. Dorothy had decided to retire, and Bob Irvin was the minority leader and best friends, and he called me, and he said, Dorothy's going to retire. I think this is, you need to run. And then I had a number of other members of the legislature and the party say, look, you prepared your whole life for this. And I've always loved the House. As a little boy, I would go down, sit in the gallery. Like I said, I was there the night Denmark Groover tried to stop the clock. And but I've just always loved the House, and interning there twice. And it seemed like the right fit, the right time. And of course, the effort was to make Sandy Springs a city. And Eva Galambos and all that crowd had urged me. They said, we really think you're the guy that can get this done. And so that it was. And then it was interesting. I worked so hard convincing other people not to run. And of course, Dorothy, Eva, all them, they would call and say, look, we're behind Joe. We're publicly endorsing him and so forth. And that helped, obviously, and cleared the field. And then I'd show up, register, and everything else. And that Friday, I get a call, and a guy shows up. He decided he wanted to run. And it was, everybody was in shock and so forth. And he and I actually have gotten to be great friends over the years, really, really good friends over the years, and so forth. But that was, yeah, it was a honest and sincere draft. People, they said, you've done all this for the party all these years, and we really think you can, make Sandy Springs a city and so forth.
So obviously you dispatched your primary opponent. Did you even have a Democratic opponent in the
Not that year.
Not that year.
Yeah. I let's see. I won the primary was 74%. I think it was of the vote.
A solid showing.
Yeah. It was. And then the next, what was it? No, that was in 02. No primary, no general. And at the last second in 04, a guy shows up as a Democrat, and he's there. He doesn't even have a checkbook with him, but he writes a check on a piece of paper, which that's legal tender. And I was like, what on earth? And his profession, master dream interpreter. Any event, I called Bobby Kahn, and Bobby and I were, even though opposite parties, I was close to Roy and to Bobby and so forth. I said, what are you all doing? He said, what do you mean, what are we doing? I said, this guy just qualified to run against me. He says, we're not going to run anybody against you. We can get along with you. If we got to have a Republican, we want somebody, that we can talk to and so forth. I said, oh, he did. And so there was a number of folks in the party. We said, well, we could probably get him forced out. The party, the Democrat Party doesn't want him and so forth. I said, well, but the problem is they've got someone who's qualified. That means the party could then go appoint someone to be the nominee and so forth. And I said, what if they appointed somebody good? I had it pretty easy,
right,
with campaigning, and so I said, no, we'll just let him stay, and he did. And again, he was a strange person.
Well, tell me what it was like in the House as a Republican. In those minority, you were only there in the minority for
4 years.
4 years. Tell me what life was like for a Republican. Obviously, this wasn't the Republican Party of the 1970s or 1980s, but what was it like in the minority in the House?
And again, I had been there in 67 and 68 working for the minority, where we had basically 10% of the membership. But it was we were in the minority, and Speaker Murphy was not real fond of Republicans. And like I said, I was very fortunate in that I had got to know him and Bill Lee and others when I was an intern, and they liked me. We got along fine. I was very respectful, and they had not forgotten that. As a matter of fact, when they gave us our committee assignments that first week, we went into Speaker Murphy's office, and we got our name badges, and we got our packets with the committees, and I was given transportation, health, and ecology. I was, it was insurance, and which was a huge committee.
Oh yeah,
especially in Georgia. And then it's now Health and Human Services, which was a huge, and transportation. And the other Republicans were just looking and said, how on earth? And I said, well, they remember me from years ago as an intern. I said, plus Calvin Smyry and I have been friends for years. And in my farewell address, I pointed out, it was Calvin who made sure I was well taken care of. But most people were not, information and audits or something. But it was.
And this was Speaker Murphy was still.
Mm-hmm. And so I I worked hard, and I never missed a day in 16 years.
Right.
Never missed a day, despite
even with your health scare,
prostate cancer, and so forth. But and they knew I was there for the right reasons. I wanted to get things done, and I wanted to get things accomplished. And so I was really, but I'm telling you, you didn't really stand a chance being that deep in the minority. I mean, it was, and as I said, it was just like the old days when I was an intern. You want something done, you go find a Democrat who likes your idea and let them go with it, which did a number of times.
Mm-hmm. There was, when you came in to the House, Bob Irvin was the minority leader, but after the 2000 election, there was a caucus, and Bob was sort of shunned aside. Lynn Westmoreland was elected the new minority leader. What was the difference in approach to say Bob's leadership versus Lynn Westmoreland's leadership?
And I'll tell you, when all this was going on, I was at state party headquarters the election night in 2000 on Monroe Drive, and we lost a number of seats. Bob had lost them over the years, the way it had worked out. And I was listening to some of the senior legislators, Republicans, and so forth, and they said, "This is why Bob needs to step aside. We need to start doing this, that, and the other, and so forth." And it was not too long after that I get a call from Lynn Westmoreland, and I knew who he was, but I hadn't really met him. And he said, "I've decided to run for minority leader, and here's why." And he went through and he gave the exact same points that had been given that at headquarters that night about, need new leadership, etc. And I'll never ever forget. I said, "Lynn," I said, "you got to understand, Bob Irvin and I have been friends, since we were kids." And I said, "And as the sitting minority leader, he endorsed me in a contested primary." And he said, "Stop right there." And he said, "Just stop right there." He said, "I would never ask anyone to betray a friendship." I said, "My goodness." He says, "No, you're not going to betray a friendship." And I said, "What if I came to be the deciding vote?" He said, "I wouldn't ask you to betray a friendship." And I said, I like this guy. And we got to be very close. But it was something. Bob, Bob is just Phi Beta Kappa at William and Mary, and honors grad from Emory Law School, and just absolutely brilliant.
Harvard Business.
Yeah, after he left the legislature the first time. And just unbelievably brilliant. Of course, he worked in the Callaway Campaign. He had just graduated from Lovett that year, and that summer before he went up to Williamsburg, and so forth. Lynn was bright in his own regard. He of course, had worked his way up through the ranks as a carpenter and had a little college and so forth. But it was, Lynn was captain of his football team. I think it was Therrell High School, and graduated in '68. And he still had that leadership mentality and so forth. And but he was very straightforward. And I give credit to all of them that had been there for so long, and they think majority, and that was the goal, to get us into the majority.
Well, 2002, not majority in the House, but obviously a very
Senate.
Historic election. Tell me about that election, your expectations. and then sort of the fallout from 2002 and what it meant for you and the Republican Party.
It was, that was, I can remember election night and in Buckhead at the hotel and so forth, and that Sonny had won, and it was a it was a bit of a surprise, and so forth, and then he was able to convince 4 senators, as I recall, to switch parties, including Jack Hill.
Right.
And that, of course, gave the Republicans control of the Senate. And we were still in the minority, but Speaker Murphy lost in 2002. And then he lost, so Terry Coleman became Speaker.
Well, now before we talk about Terry Coleman, there was talk and some effort that Larry Walker, who had been the majority leader, that perhaps there would be enough Democrats and enough Republicans to coalesce behind sort of a crossbench.
They tried, right? Very much so.
Were you involved? Well,
no,
you were knowledgeable of.
I was very much aware of it, but I was so junior. I was not brought in, and but yes, that was the goal, to make Larry the Speaker, and I was very close to Larry, still am, and to Terry. Terry was like a big brother to him, and really, even though I was Republican, he watched out for me, and very, very supportive and helpful. But they had it put together, and Carla Drenner, who Democrat, was one of the Dems working it. In the group, but they thought they had it together, and I will never ever forget when we were going into we're going to be going into session, and we were having our caucus meeting, and there was some scrambling and whatnot. We were in the 6th floor of the CLOB, and Lynn said, "Okay, I'm going to be the nominee for Speaker." We all looked and said, so obviously the deal fell apart. Right. And so forth. But it was, we really thought we pulled it off.
So that session, you have a divided General Assembly, Republican governor. Not a whole lot gets done because of that, but 04 elections, 05 session. Tell me about the transition from minority to majority.
It was, again, we'd been working on it, planning it, so we were ready. Of course, we were all still a little awestruck. What, we won? But I can tell you, I had a number of longtime Capitol observers, lobbyists, employees, and so forth. They were telling me, they said, "You all are going to take the majority." And I had people, saying, "Are you going to be who are you going to be hiring and whatever and so forth?" But it was. I did Jerry Keene was the whip, minority whip, and I had, of course, an election party, and he came over and so forth. And that's when I was running against the Master Dream Interpreter. And I said, "How do you think we're doing?" he said, we're going to take the majority. I mean, that was that afternoon or evening, but they knew probably a few weeks out that the polls were showing, and we were ready. But I had, we were ready for the transition, and I'll never forget, they had the committee on assignments, and so I had made a pitch for, it was a new committee when they formed it, when economic development, tourism, and I was, as Speaker Coleman has said, I was the only one who really had international business experience and so forth, and everyone just assumed that's where I'd wind up. And we get sworn in, they have their final meeting, I get the call, and it's Vance Smith from Pine Mountain, Junior is his nickname in Pine Mountain, and he said, Jojo, we've just finished, and you are going to be the ethics chairman.
Oh,
I said, what?
you drew the short straw.
I said, what? And I said, I thought I was going to get, economic development. He said, no. He said, Ron Stevens wants it. Ron's 4 years senior to you. And he said, but on the background checks, you don't even have a parking ticket. I mean, you've got just the cleanest imaginable record. And of course, I had all these top secret clearances in the White House and the Navy and so on, and everything. I said, yeah. And I said, Junior, if I rob a bank and have an affair, could I get a better committee? Little do we know down the road that that might have been what some of those folks did. I will never forget it. I mean, it was just, we had won.
When I interviewed Dr. Price, Tom Price, he said that they found bathrooms and rooms they never knew existed in the Capitol because they never had keys to them.
Never.
Is that true? That they were
true.
Just...
It's true. And then one of the things was, I mean, ethics it's a negative perk. It's the only way to describe it. It's tough. And we wound up going into 415, and which had been of course, the majority office. The Republican leadership had decided, since I was going to have a very tough committee, and I wasn't going to get what I'd really hoped for, they would put me in the leadership office, which is part of the story of that the documentary on that office. But yeah, it was amazing. It was just stuff we liked.
So did the Republican leadership have a policy program locked and loaded, ready to go?
Basically,
yeah.
I mean, we were ready, and it was. Yeah, and they'd been, again, think majority, so they'd been working on it. Staff and other legislators had been, Republican legislators had been making plans,
right,
for and what we would do first, and et cetera, et cetera. So it was, wow, that was rather exciting.
Right.
I'd never, ever forget that night. We were all like, oh my goodness. It was very interesting too. I had, I was at Georgia with Sonny Perdue, but and I didn't know him because he's in vet school and
right.
Different fraternities and so forth. But I had helped him a lot in the campaign, and he, I can remember Lynn Westmoreland and Jerry Keene would send me down to the governor's office a number of times, and because there was some conflicts, and Governor Cruz said, I don't understand. He said, some of these people aren't really helpful, and we're having conflicts, and he said, what is it? I said, sir, there are two things. I said, first, you're a Democrat. You were a Democrat a long time. And I said, that's those of us who, lifelong and in the trenches, we wouldn't be in the majority if it hadn't been for guys like you, coming over and helping us. So that can be overcome. He said, what is the real issue here? And I said, I'll tell you exactly. I said, election morning, I said, there were probably 60 to 80 Republicans, House and Senate, who thought you were going to lose. And they thought that one of them would be the first Republican governor. I said, that's what happened. I said, and he said, I think you're right. I said, no, I know I'm right. I said, there are people that like, oh, drat, he won.
Well, it's certainly unexpected.
Oh, yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
So you've already mentioned Sandy Springs as a major policy achievement, but what were some of the other major pieces of legislation that you worked on?
Well, tort reform and teen driving, which I did in the minority, and we did started with Senate Bill 1, but I was fortunate to be involved with economic development, ex officio and judiciary. I'd have to say that children's health and of course insurance was what a hard-working, great committee. It was. I think where I did the most good is finding consensus and finding common ground.
Right.
And even when I was in the minority, say, wait a minute, guys, we're here for the people of Georgia. And as I said, my when I got asked that by the homeschoolers that were all over the Capitol, and if you can be remembered with one word, and that's when I said conservationist, and so I got to, and we had a good bipartisan group that worked, on all these things, and it was frankly it was DuBose Porter who got me on the Jekyll Island Foundation Board, and which led now to, of course, being on the authority board and being chairman of the Jekyll Island Authority. And all that came because of working with DuBose and others on environmental issues.
During, I guess it was your first term, the state flag, whether there was a major change in the state flag.
Yep.
What position did you come down?
Oh, I had campaigned to change it. I had told the story that when I was a grammar school, I guess it was probably 1955 or so, and we're doing a tour of the Capitol, and I can remember going past, it's now the governor's parts of the governor's office, but it was Secretary of State's office and the new flag. And I can remember leaving and going down the steps across to where the old parking lot was, And there was an old black fellow, can see him today in the overalls, and he was selling boiled peanuts. And he had his box. I can still see the grease on and he had, I think it was 11 bags left, and they were 10 cents each. And my mother pulled out $1 and a dime and bought them all. And he was thrilled because he was finished for the day. Sure. I could still see him limping and walking away and so forth. And we didn't have much money. And I said, my goodness. I said, she said, the flag you just saw was made to hurt that man. And Tyrone Brooks has had me tell that story many times, and she said that is not what the Confederacy stands for, and so forth. And she said it was hurt. And of course later, they admitted that it was all part of segregation and so forth. But I had said when I was campaign primary that I said, given the opportunity, I would change it because it was changed for the wrong reasons. And I said, now I'm an unreconstructed rebel. I said, our younger son is named for Jeb Stuart, Stuart. And his I mentioned before, his it turns out it's Stuart's great grandfather, and who rode with Stuart in Phillips Legion and so forth. We're directly descended from Confederate cavalry, and I said, you honor the Confederacy, the cause, as we were always raised to say, by you honor the Confederacy, you don't, and the people and what they stood for, but not the slavery or any of that. So I had made up my mind. I said, no, if we have the opportunity to change it, we're going to change it. And I walked in that day, excuse me, and everybody was scrambling and looking at, I was saying, what is this? And they said, it's the new flag. And I said, what? And they said, yeah, we're going to vote on it. And I said, well, I know what I'm going to do. And I, of course, received threats and so forth, and through the years. And it was one of the phone calls at home. The guy said, he was so upset, and et cetera, et cetera. Excuse me. And I said, well, I'm just curious. I said, my wife and I have a son named for a Confederate general, Jeb Stuart. Do you have any children, that you've named? Well, I'm not married yet. And so I said, I guess you're waiting for your 11-year-old, first cousin to turn 12 or something to get married. And my wife grabbed the phone and said, that's it. No more of this. But, it was it was the right thing to do, no question. And then the way the flag evolved and to our current flag, it brought Georgia back together. It was a tough time, but it had to be corrected. Now I said, if you all are going to make me change Stuart's name, no.
Well, let's zoom out a bit. Now I want to get your thoughts on why Georgia Democrats held on to power so long in the state.
Well, they they knew how to control things. That's for sure. And they made, well, and it's what most Georgians believed in, and so forth. And you know, that you have people that go back, you know, who despise the Republican Party and Reconstruction and so forth. But they had really brilliant, good people, and Republicans didn't have that many, not many people. And again, the way the districts were drawn, they were able to hold on. Mm-hmm. And until those maps were changed, we couldn't take the majority.
Right.
So that was it. But it was, and again, you had, I mean, of course, I grew up in Atlanta, so it's a big city, but you look at the rural areas, and again, they control the courthouses, they control the sheriffs, everything.
Mm-hmm. So some people argue, and scholars, political scientists, that the governing philosophy of the Republican governors, Governor Perdue, Governor Deal, who of course were both Democrats before becoming Republicans, was not really that different from, say, a conservative Democrat like a George Busbee or a Joe Frank Harris, even Zell Miller to a degree. Where do you fall on that?
I have to agree. You know, I had very close to Governor Harris. He's my much older fraternity brother by 10 years, and yeah, I have to agree. Mm-hmm. I think that's an accurate thing. I had a fellow, it was a state rep from North Georgia, and he, when I was an intern, and of course Republican, he told me, he said, if we could get elected as Republicans, we'd run as Republicans if we could get elected, but we can't. And that was true. It was Mike Snow who told me that, and that was the key. I mean, you weren't going to get elected down here, or you weren't going to in Glenn County or in North Georgia. And that was the thing. If you wanted to be elected, you needed to be a Democrat.
Why do you think that the Democratic Party here in Georgia has thus far failed to mount a political comeback to retake the majority? It's been 2002, so going on 18 years in the governor's mansion, 15 or so in the General Assembly. But what gives, do you think?
It is that and it goes back to, I think, to Goldwater and the conservative philosophy and so forth, and that the Republicans, took the conservative fight and went forward. And again, friends with Governor Busbee, worked with his daughter Jan at Coke. And I absolutely agree. I mean, I don't see really any difference between Joe Frank Harris and George Deacle Busbee and Brian Porter Kemp. I mean, I think they're all basically from the same cloth, very much so. And the Democrats, it's just in my observations, I mean, they moved to the left, and Georgians have not.
Well, what do you think the biggest danger? Obviously, Democrats held power in the state for, let's say it was 133 years. What's the biggest danger to the Republican majority in the state, which is going on its second decade?
not maintaining principles, not following the path that we've come down, continuing on it, that's a concern. Certainly not a Clinton fan, but that 92 slogan, it's the economy, stupid. And as long as we maintain the business-like goals and philosophy, I think we'll be fine.
Is there a danger, if I'm interpreting this correctly, is the danger then, in your opinion, drifting from sort of the economic pro-growth into more hot-button
I think
social
so.
issues?
That's been my thought. Bobby Kennedy had the great quote, had a number of them, obviously, but the heroics come after the election, and I think we have to keep that in mind. We got to win elections, and we've got to get people reelected to do that. So yes, I think that's clearly it. Some of these issues are just. It's like going back to the young Republican days, 50-something years ago, just fighting each other. You've got to find what is best for Georgians and what is right. It's that to me. I mean, I took that oath 8 times. Took it 6 times as a naval officer. A little different oath, but I think you have to be true to the oath and to the principles.
Were you surprised at how relatively close the 2018 governor's race was? I guess there wasn't much difference between any of the races statewide, but how close those races were?
Having done campaigns all my life, I really wasn't, because I saw, and obviously having chaired ethics,
right,
and being in campaign finance and so forth through the years, seeing the amount of money that was put in, no, and because that I wasn't surprised at all, and I was very pleased with the outcome, and I point out to people that Governor Kemp received more votes than anyone ever has in the state of Georgia. So, but I was not at all surprised given the money, and like I said, having done campaigns all my life, and I was not at all surprised, and I think it was a wake up call for some who don't realize, if you get that much money, and you can do a lot.
Well, it looks like DeKalb County obviously used to be the epicenter of Republicanism in Georgia. Is now the most Democratic county in the state, but also Gwinnett County has flipped, Cobb County, Henry County, the sort of inner suburbs have appeared to have flipped. Did so in 2016 as well. Yeah. What do you think's driving that leftward trend, or we'll say Democratic trend? Leftward could be something else, but what do you think's driving that?
Of course, demographics.
Sure.
That's the first thing you look at. And I mean, I hate to say that, but it's true. I mean, the makeup of the electorate, and I think it is having, being a amateur historian, unlike you all, who's professional, but I, pendulum changes, it moves, and I think that's what part of it. And again, the race, 2018, there was a lot of money. I mean, there was a heck of a lot of money that was put in. And so, like I said, I wasn't surprised to see how close everything was, relatively close.
What about the sort of nationalizing of what used to be state races, or sort of self-contained races? You had your Georgia Democrats, and they would run their campaigns. But it seems that ever more, and we've just come through another election cycle with Kentucky and Virginia, and Mississippi, Louisiana's voting soon, and that these have become basically national elections where
Yep.
Not much ticket splitting necessarily. Do you think that trend's likely to continue?
I think with social media and the new ways of campaigning, yes, I think it will. I've watched Virginia, and again, you look at the demographics. You go to Northern Virginia, Fairfax, and so forth,
Loudon.
and it's a whole different electorate, and
similar to Metro Atlanta, which
Yeah.
Outsized influence
Yep,
and population
exactly.
concentration, I guess.
Exactly. It's I think nationally, of course, but in Georgia, Republicans are going to have to work probably twice as hard as ever before to maintain majorities and so forth. Of course, they don't have a majority in the House in Washington. But it's going to take some real hard campaigning and nonstop campaigning. And I said it's so funny. It was 2013, at the table right there. Secretary of State Kemp was finishing up breakfast, and I said, I think I've got it figured out. He said, what? I said, we're going to win 2018. And I said, it'll be a little closer probably the way things are going. And I said, 2022, we need to start working on today. And Brian looked at me, he said, what are you talking about? I said, Mr. Secretary, I'm talking about your run for governor in 2018, and then the re-election in 2022. And he said, Chairman, he said, don't you think I should worry about getting re-elected Secretary of State in 2014? I said, Mr. Secretary, I tell you what, you worry about that. Let me start worrying about 2022. And we kid that I have been working on re-election for all these years. And I have. I mean, I'm always working on it. You can come downstairs and see all my Kemp signs ready to go. But yeah, Republicans are not going to have and frankly, I think it was not that difficult in the Goldwater, the 64 election and so forth. Not that, what we win, 5 states?
6.
No. And but it's going to take a real concerted effort and real leadership and an understanding again of this is our philosophy, and how do we get this across?
Well, I guess the elephant in the room is what's the impact of Donald Trump's presidency in sort of remaking, reshaping, refocusing Republican priorities.
And I think from what I hear, in my old area up in Atlanta, that he's been negative. That's what people say. Yet, I was at the Glenn County Republican Party fish fry about 10 days ago, and these people are totally devoted to him, and we'll campaign nonstop for him. So it's again, I supported Jeb Bush in the for president. I did vote for Trump, of course. It's again, I don't know, having worked in the White House press office, I don't know how he puts up with everything and the coverage and so forth. And it's frankly, it's of course it's been biased through the years. I mean, not just recently. You can pick up any history book and go back and look and see. But it's I have to. I mean, I give Donald Trump credit. I mean, my goodness. I told one of our neighbors here, I said, you know, he's not going to be president. He's not going to get elected, but there he is, and moving along. It's and it is. We all know from history. I mean, you've got. I mean, whatever the sources of news. I mean, you've had conservative newspapers, liberal newspapers,
Sure.
et cetera.
Sure.
So, I don't know. I'm just amazed. I look at a headline that says, you know, he's losing to every Democrat running, and then you see another headline that, you know, he's swamping them and his popularity's through the roof.
That's why they run the campaigns, I guess.
You know, I just. I said I wouldn't have predicted that he was going to be president by any means.
Well, what projects have you been working on recently, just to bring it a little closer to home as we wrap up?
Well, I'm mainly spending time on Jekyll and chairing the authority, then on campaigns, if I'm asked, you know, I certainly give my opinions and,
Sure.
and help. But right now, the Jekyll Island Authority Board is taking most all my time, which I'm glad. I mean, I love the place, and again, for a conservationist, that's what we want,
Right.
and maintain it as a special place for all Georgians to enjoy.
Well, I'll have to bring my daughter down. You can introduce
Take her to the sea turtles.
To the sea turtles.
And it's again, I have been very disappointed in some criticism we received on the sea turtle protection plans. I've worked very closely with DNR and others, and I feel what we're doing is absolutely correct and good. I mean, I've been tagging loggerheads and greens for almost 50 years. I'm not an expert, but I know, you know, we're doing everything we can to protect all, well, the environment, marine life, etc. But it's I've spent a lot of time doing that, and then like I said, I do get asked for my opinion. Whether it and I guess the fact that, as Bo once said, I was probably the youngest of the founding fathers of the party, having been involved in it since I was literally 6 years old. I mean, I just turned 6, and been doing those campaigns nonstop. And you know, it was 1968. Bo had gotten on the ballot by petition in 1966, and then in '68, the first statewide primary, and again that was the Earl Patton, Jack Sells, and so forth, and we had to have a Republican organization in each one of the 159 counties. And we didn't have that many. I mean, we had the metro and
Sure.
you had
the cities.
Cities, and you had so forth. But so they made me state field director, and I went. Frank Strickland, who I had mentioned before.
Sure.
Frank took parts of North Georgia, and I took below the Nat line, and traveled nonstop.
It's a big state.
Yeah. And we would come in with our you'd have the records. Talk about the old records like we used with to try to get the legislators to vote for Bo over Lester. I mean, I would get these documents. This guy had been state chairman. Not state chairman. He'd been the county chairman. However many years ago, and so forth, and I'd make an appointment and go see him and talk to them. And I got, you had to, like I said, you had to have a county chairman, and that county chairman had to conduct the primary. And most of these places had one polling place and so forth. And it was Jeff Davis County. Me, and it was my college roommate who was also working for the party. We spent 3 days in Jeff Davis County looking for a Republican. And finally, this guy, he's a printer. And he says, I tell you what, he says, I'll do it. He says, but for $75. I said, okay, fine. And so that's how we, I don't even think he voted in the primary, the Republican primary. But Chattahoochee County, my fraternity brother, and he agreed to do it, and he said, "What are you all paying?" And I said, "Well, $50." And Charlie said, "Okay, I'll do it." And so he did everything, did it by the book, and he actually wrote a letter of resignation, after the primary and so forth. And son of a gun, if he didn't get invited into who's who in American politics, just galled me that I'd been doing all this as a youngster. And by the way, he went on to be an attorney, and he practiced for a number of years with a guy named Saxby Chambliss.
Ah, all right.
Yeah.
He went on to do something with his life.
Yeah. It's so funny during the campaign, first campaign when for Senate, and people were saying, "Is he going to have to give up the restaurants?" I said, "Not the same."
That's a Z, but
yeah, not the same. But it's again, I don't think we'll ever see days like that again for Republicans in Georgia. But my goodness, again, I was having to go everywhere, and it was I was finished up in Thomasville, and I was flying out of Moultrie. I guess it's Sunset Field, as I recall, and it was primary day, and landed in Atlanta, and there was the Constitution, and there was the article about Ben Fortson said Republicans failed to organize in all 159 counties, and I had the last papers. I knew it wasn't true, and so forth. But that's how difficult it was. I mean, Mr. Ben was he was a yellow dog Democrat, and did everything he could to fight us. But yeah, that was that primary. Oh my goodness! I mean, we literally, and okay, I'll be your county chairman for a day. And you pay me 50, pay me 75, whatever. But I'm not going to vote the primary.
Right. Well, anybody who's interested, Mr. Wilkinson's papers are available for research at the Richard B. Russell Library. And thank you very much, Joe, for taking your afternoon here on St. Simon's to talk to us about history and politics.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ellett. Now,
well,
now we can say doctor. So.
Well, that and $1, we'll get you a sweet tea. But yeah, I appreciate it, and thank you on behalf of everybody for sitting for this oral history.
Oh, yes.